AI Think Tank podcast, the future of intelligent systems, machine learning, and data science. I'm Dan Wilson, coming to you from Seattle, Washington. Today, I'm joined by John McDonald, a seasoned product leader and colleague in the tech industry. John brings nearly 20 years of global experience developing data-driven B2B and B2C solutions, with leadership roles at Constant Contact, CVS Pharmacy, and Athena Health. His work spans enterprise platform strategy, API development, and hands-on machine learning using frameworks such as TensorFlow and PyTorch. We discuss Model Context Protocol, MCP, a new open standard from Anthropic that simplifies how applications provide context to language models. John offers insight into how this can improve interoperability and accelerate enterprise AI adoption. Welcome to the show, John. How's it going?
Good morning, Dan. I'm doing well. How are you? It's good
Good.
to see you, and we're kind of in the same metro area for the first time in a long time, back
Yeah,
in
that's
back in Seattle, Tacoma area.
That's right. Yeah, I've lived here for 25 years now, and you're from out here,
Yeah,
and
we're about the same. I probably left when I was 25, so now you're catching up with me.
exactly right. We're both Redmond, Washington veterans too, and that ecosystem from years ago. I know I
Um,
in 2004 I started at Diversified Systems and became their chief technical officer for over 18 years, really. And while I was there, you were also in Redmond doing other things related to tech and have seen plenty of things grow since then. I mean, today's conversation is about Model Context Protocol, which is a brand new released open standard from Claude, Anthropic, and they have really done a number on the open source community here because now we have this extra component, this protocol to work with, no matter what we're integrating, and it's something you can choose to do or not. But if you do, all of a sudden, so many other players are using it now. But
yeah.
let's think. I mean, you and I've talked about this for a while. We actually met through MIT back in 2023, just to let everybody know, and have been heavily involved in machine learning and neural networks and AI, of course, in its many forms since then. And I know you're actually out there on the East Coast, okay, and able to actually attend some of these particular events live.
Yeah.
And I'm over here stuck in Seattle doing my thing. But yeah, you have this vast, deeply rooted history and watching these standards grow over the decades.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your experience in Redmond and a lot of the things that we see parallel right now today with this new exciting standard called MCP.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. And
Uh-huh.
so, no, it was super interesting to me because our class was great. That was a super intensive 6-week course, and we learned so much about the fundamentals of AI and working with the models and having hands-on. And it was great. But
Hmm.
I would say the best thing of that class, of the whole experience, was the cohort that
Hmm.
I would say you organized. So that was fantastic because that group of people were able to share all of their learning together.
Hmm.
And
Right.
so it was fantastic to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, Lorenza started all that off by adding me to the WhatsApp groups. That's how that happened. And
Yeah.
and before we knew it, we were all picking each other's brains, and it was just a still a vast ecosystem of friends who come together. So yeah, it's
It was
amazing. That was
wonderful.
a year and a half, over a year and a
Yeah.
half ago. So at this
Yeah.
point, so it's incredible to have that. And here we are today for the exact same reasons, our community. So, but we go back to Redmond. It's
Yeah.
small world, and that
Yeah.
that ecosystem and community is something else.
Yeah.
And anybody could just walk through your door back then in the early 2000s. You never know.
Yeah.
And let's so I worked with a lot of the interface with companies and including with device technologies and digital forensics type
Yeah.
operations and stuff. And so, but so where were you
So
starting off at?
it was early in my career.
Mhm.
It was one of the first, let's say, desktop based, SQL based database
Mhm.
companies. So it was
Right.
called MicroRim. And we were back in those days, Microsoft had a small number of buildings in what is now Microsoft Place.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
used to be Evergreen Place.
Oh
And so
yeah.
there was a handful
Mhm.
of companies there, and we were one of them. And it was a guy who actually worked at Boeing for quite some time. And he developed some database technology based on SQL, and he
Mhm.
brought it to the market when DBase, if you remember, DBase was a big player, Access was a big player.
Hmm. Oh yeah.
So fortunately for me, that was an opportunity for me to learn SQL right away. I had
Hmm.
to.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that, and then funny for me, that became a
Hmm.
standard, right?
Hmm.
So if you're doing database access at all, that became a standard, and it made it easy to access data repositories no matter where they are. So
Right.
SQL is kind of like a standard too.
Hmm.
And going back to our class, so after our class at MIT, I also did a boot camp this year,
Hmm.
and it was fantastic because we were going through a lot of the same material, but
Yeah.
things had changed so much that it was great to
Hmm.
get a refresher. And
Yes.
that's when MCP came up for
Hmm.
me. And I gave a presentation to our class saying, guys, back in the days when client server technology was just coming to the forefront, it was the same kind of integration challenges we all had. And
Hmm.
along came a standard, something like Open Database Communication Protocol, that enabled all the database developers who were out there to
Hmm.
develop one application and then connect it to any database that supported that protocol.
Right.
I said,
Yeah.
this is very similar to what we're seeing now with
Uh-huh.
MCP.
Right.
So
There's
when I was
yeah.
going back and looking at your presentations where we were doing things like presenting RAG.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
So
retrieval
RAG was
augmented
all about,
generation. Yeah,
yeah, so it was
exactly. Hmm.
retrieval augmentation, right? So
Hmm.
it was updating the context. And
Hmm.
then we started passing in prompts, and we were toying around with a lot of the same challenges in our demos. And we're saying,
Hmm.
wow, this is really powerful
Hmm.
if we're able to add to the context, then
Yeah.
the LLMs can actually solve very, very sophisticated use cases.
Right. It's just like having CRUD operations available. Just simple stuff like that, like the most basic of tools. Like can you read? Can you write? Can you update? Can you delete? Like
And
it's
the quality is only as good as the context that you provide. So, do you remember
hmm.
back in the day where we were saying, here's a document that's a sample document. I want you to
Yeah.
review it and then give me
Hmm.
a summary based on this content.
Right.
So,
Right.
you can really enhance the capabilities and the accuracy of these LLMs by creating a sophisticated context that it's working
Yes.
with.
And that's what it's about too, because
That's
you
what this is about.
uh-huh. Because RAG is really on its way out at this point. We don't really, that's not a selling point anymore. There are a lot of different ways of looking at this because they
Yeah,
say even like this week, I'm reading and listening to things talking about how well normal tool or function calling is changing too,
right.
and that's evolving into something else. And it's just well, you look at all the intermediary steps and middle points to help,
Yeah.
translation layers, and it's all coalescing a lot, under one roof, really, in a way.
Exactly. I mean, think back to our
Yeah.
exercises early in that class. We were
Hmm.
understanding how these LLMs work, but we knew they were only as good as the training data that they
That's
were
right.
trained on.
Uh-huh.
And they didn't understand current events, right? Because
Hmm.
they didn't know anything about that context. So
Right.
RAG was trying to plug the hole or
Hmm.
trying to extend the context to
Yeah.
something more than just the training data.
Right. It's a quick and dirty without having to fine tune or retrain,
Yeah,
just like, here's some extra because it's not a part of its corpus.
right.
It will eventually wash out. I
Exactly.
mean, I like to use
Exactly.
the blank sheet of paper analogy where you have this long sheet of paper at the very top, you write a word and you keep having a conversation and that paper represents the context window. And if you don't bring something back up after a while, it leaves the whole frame, right? And it
Right.
never gets reincorporated back into the conversation.
Yeah.
And so context gets lost. Now, even with the most expensive models, this happens. And, we talk about, oh, it's hallucinating or whatever, but
Mhm.
that's not, I mean, that term is odd, really. It's just
Yeah.
doing its best to inference.
Well,
If you catch,
it hasn't
yeah,
seen it before, right? So it's
uh-huh.
inaccurate because it hasn't seen some of that data.
Hmm.
So RAG will help with creating an updated context that it can
Yeah.
look at. And also we saw tools like search. Like
Hmm.
if you don't have enough information about this topic, use
Hmm.
web search to see if you can augment your context that way.
Hmm.
So tools and RAG and other components are all trying to enrich the context that you have.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
that's when these companies started to see, well, there's a real opportunity now because people are going to be updating their context all the time for these
Hmm.
models. So let's create a standard way to do it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what MCP is all about.
I really and I learned so much when DeepSeek came out. The latest release of DeepSeek, R1. Is it R1? Yeah. When that came out, just being able to see its chain of thought in the beginning and its reasoning was incredible. And it helped me do some things that got me to my first from scratch agent, right? Now I
Hmm.
could take my homebrew agent with whatever memory system I have and incorporate the model context protocol, which happens through servers. We'll get into that later here. And I'm no expert at this, okay? This is all very new to a lot of people right now, and I'm coming to you for advice, John. But anyways, so it doesn't matter what you have, though, as long as you use the standard, you can have it, interoperate with a variety of data sources, right? So, but anyway, if you have something that's not in the corpus of a LLM, okay, and it's not a part of its training data, it won't have that to inference later. RAG is a temporary bandage for that. But having a more intelligent framework around that is an intelligent system and something that manages memory differently. Okay.
Yeah.
Because we're not just you could say, well, the human brain is sort of like a storage device,
Yeah.
sort of is. But we're not really geared for direct, accurate memorization one to one the same way like a computer hard drive is. We always
Yeah.
have different feelings, moods, and chemicals that drive that internal recall, and it might come out a certain way. Our temperature is relative just as
Yeah.
much as an LLM, right? You could be on one and really go at it and embellish things, right? But and you'd be surprised. You get together. You have episodic memory is a big focus of mine, and that's what got me into doing things with the MIT efforts, which was, hey, I built a simulated limbic brain for managing episodic memory. And
Yeah.
that sounds weird, but it worked, and it was
Yeah.
great. Okay,
Yeah.
and it used a lot of. I had my own framework essentially, and it auto journaled and would auto do a lot of things for itself to gain sentiment, to understand why and how it got where it got in the context. And when it went back to that through a database, no vector database, no graph knowledge base. This is all something I did that was quick and dirty from scratch. But when I did this, it was able to gain footing again and have that context. And it
Yeah.
was wonderful, right? It
Yeah.
was, it was fast. It was wonderful. Whether
Yeah.
it was scalable or not is another question. And I'm not here to argue that, okay? There's a lot to grow on, though, okay? But it was exciting when I heard about MCP. And I thought to myself, oh, man, we've got to all talk about this. And then sure enough, you're talking about it. Everybody starts talking about it in the group. And then here we are. So,
But
um,
it was one thing that was interesting to me is when I went back and I looked at some of our old videos of when we were
mhm,
sharing information, I look back and I think I should have seen this coming because we
mhm.
were doing things with it and everybody was trying to figure out how to work with these things most effectively. So you were
Yeah.
starting to tap into it and we were
Hmm.
starting to notice things like, oh, you can say, enter in a prompt and say, don't use any tools. So
Right.
internally, the
Hmm.
things like Claude and other LLMs were under the covers using tools like web search to,
Yes.
if they didn't have enough information in their
Hmm.
training data, then
Hmm.
they would go and search to try to update the context of the query. Then, okay, people began to say, well, you can really the way Anthropic talks about it, they say, really, this is about augmenting LLMs
Hmm.
through in a loop. So you're augmenting the
Yep.
results based on either tools or file systems or
Hmm.
external APIs. And then it'd be, oh, wow, this is really powerful. If you can have not just prompts back and forth, but you can have agents doing this
Yeah.
in a structured way.
Uh-huh.
Then it's like, okay, wow, this is
Yeah.
really a paradigm shift.
Because agents are interfacing with each other. We saw that like 2, 3 months ago.
Yeah,
With the voice models, it was in
exactly.
a laptop, and you had the phone, and it says, "Hi, I'm
Yeah,
here to make a reservation for so and so. I'm so and so's agent." And it says, "Oh," and the other AI changed its tone and
yeah,
actually start. Well, let's go into that other mode, and they start communicating like modems, right, with a
yeah,
funny sound and everything. I love
yeah.
that.
So,
Um, yeah.
Anthropic's take on it is quite interesting. They're like, we know that these models are going to continue to evolve and be more
Hmm.
sophisticated over time. And we know the agents are also going to get more and more sophisticated. What we need is a way for any application to update the context
Yes.
dynamically.
Hmm.
So, because that's kind of like let's say the short-term memory. Or
Yes.
if
Uh-huh.
you're that's short-term memory, it's not was
Mhm.
not a part of the training data, it's
Right.
either new to it or it's
Mm-hmm.
something that you want to have a little bit different than what it
Mm-hmm.
understands. And they said, well, if we provide um, a common way to integrate, and not just for our LLMs, but any, then the
Mm-hmm.
whole industry is really going to benefit. And it's similar to what you and I were chatting about earlier, which is that's what the LSP, the language server protocol, really
Mm-hmm.
did for IDEs.
Yeah.
Because you're an IDE vendor, and you know that the people who are using your IDE could be using any kind of language. But if you can
Mm-hmm.
provide a common way for your users to integrate with any of those languages, people are going to use your tool if it's the best one out there.
Yeah.
So it was quite admirable to see Anthropic. It was incubated there, but they, I think, put it out there and said, this is an open standard. So the
Mm-hmm.
community is in full control over this. We
Right.
recommend it because we
Uh-huh.
see this as huge potential,
Right.
but let's let the community actually develop it over time. It's great.
It's so approachable. It's the right thing to do, you know? Like if you want people to I love Claude, okay? I use OpenAI, different models for different reasons, okay? And I don't use the API for anything anymore. I quit doing that. But I use
I
Claude.
have
I'll
I have a
use
case for you too. We can
Oh yeah.
your
Yeah.
thought.
Uh-huh. Yeah. The Gemini that was at 2.5 is doing really great, you know, very large context window. And that's another topic that relates to a lot of this based on,
Mhm.
what do we need next with all these big windows. But
Yeah.
I again, I remind people out there, you can't just throw a bunch of money and processors at everything, right? And
Yeah,
maybe you can, but can you make it work smaller and more effectively? That's the real power. And from the
exactly.
ground up, I treat it like a file system, at the
Yeah.
lowest level and really contemplate the error correction that occurs in our normal daily thought process as well,
Yeah.
and look at it like a simple logistics puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Where is that thing and why? And context, whether it has it or not, it'll have this idea, it'll have the content, but it won't have the context,
Right.
right? And that's
Right.
the difference between RAG and an intelligent system being
Yeah.
managed properly.
Yeah, that's one of the
Hmm.
cool things about MCP that it really hasn't been utilized to date, but
Hmm.
it's super powerful, which is the bidirectional aspect of it. So you and I were chatting about the servers. So you
Hmm.
set up the clients and the servers. You can also have the servers. You can guide it and say, here's some configuration parameters that you should use when you need to talk back to the LLM and
Hmm.
get inference. So in your case, if you're managing your budget and
Hmm.
you have an agent that's doing its task, but it needs to go back to the LLM and
Hmm.
do another request, you can say, don't exceed this many tokens,
Hmm.
or choose whatever LLM is best for this request based on these factors. Like, I don't want it to
Uh,
spend more than my
uh-huh.
budget, or I
Right.
don't want it to do certain things. So, in the middle of its task, if it needs to go back to an LLM, you
Hmm.
can guide it and say, don't do this if it's going to exceed my token limit, or you can manage the
Hmm.
budget through these things as they go. So,
That's
and
really
I remember you
nice.
and I were in the team was struggling with, well, how do we manage the cost of
Oh
this?
yeah, man,
It's
it was incredible.
huge,
This
right?
token, what do you call it? With token calculator,
Yeah.
And I would use this a lot, especially in programming. The term vibe coding is so funny, but again, it was in what September 2023. I started doing that, and it was
Mhm.
through Jupyter Notebooks, a plugin through OpenAI, and Notable.io, which doesn't
Yeah.
exist anymore. A
Yeah.
big sad story there. But since then, I rebuilt from the ashes, and instead of trying to incorporate like a Jupyter Lab situation or what have you for this live coding, I went straight to the Python shell and did everything locally, and actually got way better
Yeah.
performance and a lot more flexibility. Now, my agent will automatically update itself, it can update pip update certain things, pip install when it feels like it needs that. And it surprises me. I sat
Yeah.
back and
Awesome.
watched the two LLMs work together in that
Yeah.
multi, and it's like one agent, but it's two models, and they took 16 minutes to hash out code,
Yeah.
correct it,
It's
reinstall, and then all of a
amazing.
sudden it worked,
Amazing. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
at 2,500
Well,
lines of code, and that
well,
was it, which is pretty, minimal on the large
yeah.
these days. But anyway, like back to
It's
where you're
amazing.
coming from, there's a standard that's also what we said, USB-C is the other thing we were throwing around, right?
Yeah.
Where this is like
Yeah.
another way to come together.
it's a standard way to kind of connect um, a data source to some other repository. So it's a standard way to integrate, like a USB channel, or then you don't have to worry about connectivity. You can just plug it in and it works, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Right.
like ODBC, you don't have to worry about writing all of the SQL or the update or the CRUD operations for each of
Mm-hmm.
the potential databases that this app's going to
Right.
run on. You just do it
Uh-huh.
once, and then the ODBC layer translates
Uh-huh.
everything based on your endpoint, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's what it really does is
Uh-huh.
it abstracts away all the complexity of the endpoint repositories that you want to integrate with.
Mm-hmm.
But the cool thing about it though is so that's on the outbound side when you're looking for information. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say in the middle of your task, you're saying, I need to go and check the LLM again, but I don't want to exceed my budget. So do a search out there and find me the cheapest LLM to execute this request. And it could be not Anthropic or Claude, it could be
Mm-hmm.
some other LLM
Oh, sure. Yeah.
suited for that, right? And so
Uh-huh.
based on those parameters, your agent can be way
Mm-hmm.
more sophisticated on
Mm-hmm.
how it's executing and completing your tasks.
Right. I mean, honestly, it's just another tool for it to call really another function in a way, like you could say on your local computer, I have 60 or about 70 different local models on my PC. Okay. Not all at the same time, but I'll run it two at the same time, depending.
Right.
And you use a really small version of a model like Llama 3.2, it's very small. And it's great for utility purposes. You're not trying to get it to write poetry, okay?
Yeah.
But it can spell check and can do a lot of
Good
great
enough.
things.
It's
Good
good enough
enough,
to
right?
do the
But
job.
what's even smaller is BERT or bidirectional
Yeah.
transformer, or
Yeah.
SBERT.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different intermediaries that we're not looking at. What if you want to use a state space model? State
Yeah.
space is different than a transformer architecture model.
Yeah.
It is real. They can do similar things, but they have their own strengths.
Yeah.
And in fact, state space is being used for voice a lot
Yeah.
more these days. So,
And the way that I look at this is, and you and I were chatting about this before, this
mhm.
is a protocol just for the context,
That's
right?
right. That's
Keeping that
right.
up.
Yeah.
And there's going to be other,
Uh,
it's going to be, it's not going to be the end all be all.
hmm
You're going to have, let's say, like the A2A,
hmm
agentic communication or orchestration
Right.
there. That
Uh-huh.
can sit on top of it and handle
hmm
all of the orchestration between all these agents that are involved in your tasks.
hmm
But for updating the actual context in order to complete the task, they
hmm
said we need a standard way to handle that.
Yeah, look at, I mean, and let's I have a rough example out there for everybody, and it's based on the way I've had to manage things thus far. But just like we were saying, or I was talking about the page of paper, kind of being your context window, like a rough representation of that. If you when you have a conversation with an LLM, it activates certain neural networks, and there is a performance gain by having that already activated. And so, furthermore, your conversations will be quick and what have you. Okay. But when you first load up an LLM and start prompting it, it takes a little bit longer than it would to respond after the fact, depending.
Mhm,
Okay. And it's related to this.
mhm.
So once the context gets really full, it can start to get cloudy and dirty. And if you lose half of why you were coding something, because code is difficult to work with, even though they say, oh, you don't need to learn to code. That's not true. All right. It's not
Yeah,
true. It's not perfect. It's not even close. But I thought to myself, well, it just needs a project mandate. It needs a manifest. Like, here's what we're building. Here's the tools and the environment we have, right? And that is a line of text that keeps getting reprompted to it. So you could say, well, once we know we're filling this up, we're going to flush the whole window just to be safe and reprompt it with the newly gained insights that have been
yeah,
summarized. But we always leave that seed. Here's our directive. We're trying to build this software that does XYZ, right? And if you pass this project between multiple agents, they need a sort of checklist. All
yeah,
right. One of them might even have the ability to edit the checklist, right? Except for, one of them can only mark check, but one
yeah,
of them could add new entries to it,
yeah,
right? Sort of a Q star system. You have
yeah,
the larger models doing the biggest brain work.
yeah,
But when you need something small, if you're just doing error correction, you don't need to pull out a big truck just to go to the corner store, for like an apple. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's pointless. So
Yeah.
all that a long time ago, we thought, hey, you know, this is hard to predict how much it's or hard to project how much it's going to cost with all these tokens. Then when DeepSeek came out, it really revolutionized, or their newest iteration, it revolutionized a lot of things. And people were like, wow, I can do way more with less. And this makes things more feasible. And all the while, as time has passed, we've seen API rates plunge, you know,
Yeah.
like, I
Yeah.
don't know, you can do a lot with ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo still, right? But you're not going to get certain other, you know, it's done. It's not going to be updated anymore, you know,
Yeah.
unless someone else does it themselves.
No,
So,
I think I
yeah.
think this approach is super smart. You know, they're like
Mhm.
these things are going to evolve over time. So the
Yeah.
language models themselves are going to get more and more sophisticated as you go. And
Hmm.
also these agents are going to get more and more, the applications and the agents are going to get more and more sophisticated.
Hmm.
But they're all using the context window as the short-term memory for even things like, remember in our class when we had some of the presentation about personality,
Oh,
right? So
yes,
you can
that's
use the
right. Hmm.
context window to say, I want you to use this personality type to
Hmm.
answer and generate all of the new content coming out of it. That's
Uh-huh.
one of the things that's captured in context.
Hmm.
So
Right.
that need is always going to be there, but we need a way that over time people have a common standard way to interact with the context.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. And it's a very useful thing too. Like it's about engaging at a level, a very particular level. Like if you're going to write this report, you can write it to the C-suite, you can write it to the CISO, you can write it to the managerial staff, you can write it to sales. The same information basically will get passed on, but the way it was done will be geared toward what they need to hear about it. You know,
Yeah,
security for this, for security for that, you know,
yeah.
different worlds. And so there's always been a lot of uses for that, you know, all that flexibility. But
And the prompt templates,
mhm,
so all of the
mhm,
things, so Anthropic does a decent job kind of describing the environment that your context works with. It's things like tools and
mhm,
prompts. So, and there's things that the user is in control of, and there's the
mhm.
things that the application is in control of, and
Yeah.
there's things that the model is in control of, like tools. Like we saw before, you can, back in the day, you were never able to use like web search in your prompts.
Yeah.
You would just submit the prompt and you would get a result
Mhm.
back.
That's
But now you
right.
can say, either if you don't have the info that you need, use a
Mhm,
tool. So do a web search and update my context so
mhm,
that I can be more accurate and more performant.
mhm,
So then they started to think, okay, well, all of these things are going to be used to augment the capabilities of an LLM.
mhm.
And
Right.
it's funny when I look back on our class, we were starting to use those things.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, okay, now that's becoming standardized for people.
Yeah.
And this is just the next step in the evolution. It's like okay, now there's so many people trying to do so many things with it
Hmm.
and integrate with other systems to complete their tasks. Let's
Right.
define a standard so that everybody is working off the
Mhm.
same
Right.
communication.
Yeah. This is in the name of automation, and for a lot of reasons. I mean, this is the goal
It
here.
makes it easy. You know,
Uh-huh.
you can sit down and do any kind of integration you want, but it's a one-off,
Yeah.
and that doesn't scale. So we need a way
Right.
that everybody is going to be able to expose their functionality, whether you're Git or whether you're Gmail or whether you're Salesforce.
That's
If
right.
you expose your functionality in a standardized way, then everybody's going to be able to take
Well,
advantage of
yeah,
it.
imagine a company has, you know, a brick and mortar store, maybe several of them, and retail, you know, clothing perhaps, and they're managing inventory across locations. And with the MCP, the agentic awareness is, you know, on par with what's really going on. It's dynamic. It's not having to, it's able to turn to the right source and get a real answer to deduce instead of infer or
Yeah,
extrapolate, you know,
yeah,
actually to get that. So, I mean, you can set in real, there's some logic that can be relied on, but there's a point where it's really probable extrapolation and it's
yeah,
not the same.
yeah,
MCP came out in November of last year. Okay, so what was it? That's 5 months old,
yeah,
right? About.
yeah.
And already OpenAI has adopted it. Google has adopted it. And Claude made, Anthropic created this,
Yeah.
right? Not everybody else is doing different things. And so to everyone out there, it's a server that you run and you set up a very small, minimal MCP server for every connection out there that you want. So let's say I had a local database on my home network here, maybe on another computer or on mine, and I could have an MCP server interface with that, and that my application would use that protocol to have a two-way communication with it. And
Yeah.
then we would have another one. Let's say I have a private repository and just a folder, right, of just text files. Who knows? Documents of different sorts, right? And so that's another data source. All right. But then, like what you were saying, the real power is to have the ability to reach out through APIs and to connect to various web sources for, information or function and tools, things like that. And that's the real power. There is that dynamic RAG type of, hey, let's find out. Let's get
Yeah.
some citations on that because
Yeah.
yeah, we watched it have not have internet access or web search to having plugins that allowed that to then having web search, and then growing from there the ability to connect to further to things.
Yeah.
So it's really exciting. And so one of those things would be like you said, like email, kind of like Zapier puts things together as well, but also like GitHub or like accessing code, and like, oh, my agent can pull and push different things around, and has the ability to update some things out there for me on a repository. It's very useful. All of a sudden, you have this small model that can dynamically call large amounts of data and use it. The only
Exactly.
limitation is your context window at that point. And
Yeah.
there's no matter how many tricks you use, there is a limit to how you can trick the context window into keeping everything into perspective. I've tried a
Yeah.
lot. I've learned a lot. The idea is to fail fast,
Yeah.
and to
Well,
really find out what works and
I think it's super exciting because I mean, going back, I started in Redmond. I
mhm,
did I did my work there with databases, and I've worked in
mhm.
enterprise databases, Sybase, PowerSoft,
Yeah.
application development tools. I've been a product manager in financial services and also marketing. I've done quite a few different threads, but I also spent a lot of time being product managers for dev platforms or API
Mhm.
platforms. So I
Right.
did that a while ago, and that was just back in the days where the standards like REST were coming out.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
SOAP was out there for a while, and that was
Hmm.
replaced by REST. And that's really the power of some of these platforms is when you can integrate in a standard way so that
Hmm.
other application developers can leverage the core competency that you're providing from your application. That's when
Right.
things start to mushroom, right?
Yes,
So
that's
for
right.
me, it's
Hmm.
super exciting because now the AI world is getting to be in the same place. People are understanding, wow, the real power here comes from models like LLMs, which are great, but
Hmm.
they're super powerful when you can integrate them with other sources to complete these more and more
Hmm.
sophisticated tasks. And
That's
they do
right.
it through APIs, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
MCP is allowing companies like whatever it's Salesforce or the
Hmm.
Microsoft stack, they're all now providing official MCP servers saying, if you want to integrate with GitHub,
Hmm.
here's the official supported MCP server, so you can execute all of your GitHub requests and get your responses back in an official way that adheres to this MCP standard, which is an open source, community supported. So everybody's going to agree to do things the same way.
Yeah.
It allows you now to say, well, let me focus now as an application developer on what tasks do I want to accomplish.
Hmm.
And I know I have a
Yeah.
standard way to interact with any tool that I need to complete the
Hmm.
task. Then it's
Yeah.
like, hey, wow, this is
Yeah.
getting super sophisticated. And then
Hmm.
on top of that, as we saw the other week, this A2A standard came out for interagent
That's
communication.
right.
So
Uh-huh.
now I can do that in an effective way, and then I can govern the update of my context in a
Hmm.
standard way through MCP. So
Yeah.
they're complementary to each other.
Yeah. It's like,
Super powerful, super
yeah,
powerful.
we're building explainability from the outside in at
That's
this
awesome.
point by doing this, in a way. So again, it's like I look at it like an LLM is a memory it's just a bunch of memories, but without that management around it, you're not going to have the I want to say feelings, but it needs the insight, and that comes from context awareness and other things.
Yeah.
And so I had mine like self-journaled, like what is it, extension 3 file system, in Linux, and it's a self-journaling file system for error correction if something to crash. They're missing bits.
Yeah.
So I had a self-journaling memory system, it was a
Yeah.
living, breathing cognitive memory system I had built. Now I have a new iteration of that that's way beyond that. Now I'm very happy. Um, and all from
Well,
scratch. So
yeah, I
having
mean,
MCP is a
yeah.
powerful leverage for me to go outside of that box and reach
Well,
another
I
level.
think the analogies are interesting because it's like, I'm looking at the Space Needle behind you, and it's like, well, if somebody said to me, "Hey, John, plan out a day for me in
Mhm.
Seattle," I would do it based on my context, which was a long time ago, right? But you
Mhm.
have newer contexts of the things that are new, right?
Mhm.
So my context window doesn't have some of that new stuff. So what would I do? I would do a web search, or I would do
Mhm.
investigations online and update my context window. So now I
Right.
have
Yeah.
everything updated.
Yeah, here's a really good example out there to everybody too. A lot of us in the open source community, and no matter what, we use Ollama, Ollama. It's software that you install to your Windows machine or Linux, okay, and or Mac. And what it does is it allows you to serve up the inference to different models. It'll download and manage them and store them, but it allows you to access on your local host network uh, that service, and anything can use it. So I'll use, for example, Open Web UI or my homebrew Python chat program, and it's very powerful in that, you have this standard server. A lot of people use it. It's easy to call things from it. It has some of its own tooling. Yeah, I wonder how long it's going to take. We look at our watches and say maybe in 6 months, MCP will be even further embedded into other things like Olama, perhaps, like where all of a sudden they have functions and tools that they update inside of that, things that you can do. I think we're going to see some big booms in that, and especially
Yeah.
in that adoption. But
And also, as these things evolve, one thing you and I were chatting about is this is changing so quickly, right?
mhm,
So there's new MCP servers coming out all the time, but
yeah,
they're a little bit ahead of the game. They're realizing that, okay, because we're a community, let's do things like create an official registry for like an
yes,
API
yeah,
registry so that
uh-huh,
make discoverability easier, right?
hmm,
So if you're giving an agent a task, they
yeah,
can also say, what's the best MCP server that's out there that meets these guidelines that will allow me to do this task?
hmm,
And so you have to have a central managed repository of all those APIs that are out there. And then you can make it easier for agents themselves to discover, oh, there's a new server that's out there and it's officially supported and it follows the guidelines that I have for completing my tasks. I'm going to use
yeah,
it rather than one
hmm,
that I was using before. And it
right.
can install and it can
Mm.
execute without even knowing much about that MCP server. If it follows a certain standard and it meets your
Mm.
guidelines, it can do all of the setup on its own. So
Right, dynamically, right. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
super
So
powerful.
it's like back to the old llama thing that I was bringing up is like older models, like let's say one from last year, or maybe yeah, last year, like but a whole year ago last year, in fact. Those models aren't aware of how Olama works on, and if you get one of those older models to try to write code, like create me a chat program that uses Olama and accesses this, right? It will use deprecated calling, and then you have to update it. So
Right.
I would copy and paste. Here's how you use Olama now, and then boom, it worked. And it would just took a small update of it right there just to show it that. So it was
Yeah.
easy. I like your
Well,
idea. So that the dynamically looking, if you can't, you have a list of things that work, but you can also go out and choose it. But you need a quality rating for it. You need to say, well, it would seem that based on my research that this is a better one over this one because XYZ reasons, right?
yeah.
But that's
Well,
the power. But that's what's so
yeah,
powerful. It can
the
determine on its
example that you
own.
and I were chatting about, it surprised me a little bit just because I don't naturally look in this area, but
Hmm.
I didn't know that one of the first killer apps was going to be IDEs for developers. Right.
Yeah,
And then the
yeah.
standard that
Uh-huh.
enabled that was the language server protocol that you and I were talking about,
That's
LSP.
right.
So
Uh-huh.
that is similar. So you think about trying to describe a problem that you want solved through an automation of code.
Mm-hmm.
If your IDE has the ability to interact with multiple languages, you could say, give me a Python script that does this, or give me
Mm-hmm.
an Emacs script that does that, or
All right.
give
Yeah.
me something in your IDE
Mm-hmm.
and have it use this language.
Mm-hmm.
And that protocol actually does the integration between your IDE and the code that gets generated out of it
Mm-hmm.
through that LSP protocol. So if all the
Right.
language providers provide an LSP server for their
Mm-hmm.
language, then it's awesome. Anybody who's using Copilot or Windsurf or whatever IDE, they can code and
Mm-hmm.
have automation of code in any language they want.
Right.
Use
Imagine
that
people who
process.
want to, yeah, imagine wanting to integrate and do Shopify development with Liquid.
Right.
You can add a Liquid code block and do things with
Right.
that. I do that commonly. And now your agent can,
Yeah.
and let's think, I mean, there's the talk that the narrative that I've always had and with a lot of these developers is that the self-driving computer, and your agent needs some tools, some basic tools, the ability, an email account and the ability to email and text you. Hey,
Right.
that thing's done, pop up an alert, whatever you set up, right? It needs the ability to have tools. It needs read-write access a certain way. It needs the ability to call out questions, again, reach out to you, human in the loop, right? It needs the ability to have instructions that can follow or augment some kind of, journaling. So that
Yeah.
self-driving car or self-driving computer now, you know what I mean? You give it just enough and it can do things for you. So I know people who have been doing this for about a year now where they have their agent automatically call and book reservations for dinner, and then it lets them know, hey, you have a dinner at 6 p.m. booked for two at such and such restaurant, and they really use it.
Yeah.
you know these are the same people that would prank, is this day in AI, they're fantastic throughout Australia, but these are the same people that pranked pet shops and pet grooming shops with the agent calling and saying, can you help groom my little pig? Like,
Yeah.
wait, what? And they try to get it past them. The agent tried to trick the human. It's very funny. They got very far with it, but it's
Well,
amazing
I
how
mean, think
interactive
about
it
the
can become.
typical developer workflow in an IDE, right? Which is
Mhm.
I have these multiple languages that I can write code in any language that I want or supported. I
Yeah.
have access to a GitHub repository, so I'm going to do a pull request from there. If I run into any issues, I'm going to log them in Jira through this
Hmm.
interface as well.
Right.
And then
Right.
I'm going to test it through an automated test tool. And it's like,
Hmm.
okay, well, this is getting interesting because now it's starting to encroach on that's doing not 100%, but it's doing a big portion of that daily workflow activity that a typical developer flow in the life
Hmm.
cycle. It's like, okay, so that model really started to take off. And now I think it was inspired by that approach. It said, well, that now MCP is you can interact with any of these other external tools, and we're going to provide an easy way to integrate with the context that's going to be critical for these models
Yeah.
going. Right?
Yeah.
So that's
Exactly.
really the
Yeah.
bottom line.
Uh-huh. I love it, man. Yeah, there's a lot to take away from this because
There is. We'll have to do
it's so many ideas that I have already. And I mean, I usually have a lot more to show on things like this, but it's been quite the ride in the last few weeks, watching things change, changing them myself, having some things not work, like I said, fail fast so you can figure out what not to do and where to
Well,
go.
so I'll
Uh,
plant a seed with this case that you were talking about earlier, which is what do you do when your context starts to get too full, right? And
hmm hmm
MCP also has some capabilities of extending that memory by pulling things out of context and maybe storing them locally.
Yeah,
So
right, exactly.
if things start to get full and you don't want to
Mhm.
exceed a certain cost barrier, there's ways to pull that out and store it in a more efficient way
Right.
while the task is still going, right? So
Hmm
they're starting to open up. I have this context window and it's of a certain size, and I
hmm
need to manage that effectively. That might also mean if I exceed that, I need a way to flush that out, but in a way
Yeah.
that I can restore it when I need to. And I know you were doing that
Yeah.
in some ways, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, at least significant data.
I just popped something in the chat for you that's probably super helpful for everybody else. It's called
Mm-hmm.
pulsemcp.com, which is a really cool site that it's like an official MCP server
Mm-hmm.
directory with a list of all the active MCP servers that are out there.
Right.
There's a way to filter them for the one that are provided by official providers. So
Mm-hmm.
you can start to see there's GitHub and Figma and
Mm-hmm.
Google and Superbase, Jira, all the usual suspects. So someone
Right.
like Slack or Microsoft Teams,
Mm-hmm.
any of these providers are going to realize that, okay, a lot of people will be using those services
Mm-hmm.
and they enable really easy access through official releases of MCP servers.
I love that. It's important too, especially for security.
Yeah.
For the sake of security, that was another thing that we were all talking about this week is the
Yeah.
potential for issues like that. The things that I found were things like OAuth token theft,
Hmm.
prompt injection, and tool poisoning. And there's, that's can be kind of high level for some people or what have you, but you can still take information you shouldn't have in training data depending on the model, how it's locked down or what have you, or someone's
Hmm.
built their own, let's say a company had fine-tuned a model a certain way, but and it works for what they want, but it also there's some other unknown things, some bugs that may come out of it, and you could
Yeah.
exploit that. And tool poisoning. There's a lot of man in the middle attacks. Everything that I look at AI as data and data science. I don't really think about it the same way as I think the hype is. And
Yeah.
I just say, hey, this is a device security issue and a software security issue and an endpoint security issue. These are all weak points. Where's the gap? And
Hmm.
all this, and what can we determine?
Yeah.
Uh, how a compromised MCP server could infiltrate user data. Again, it would be my way of getting into your system, pulling out all of your documents, having that be communicated out. I can talk your bot into giving my bot information. There's a lot of, I
Hmm.
mean, this is all built on, a natural language processing, but it's funny, NLP is neuro linguistic programming too. And it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised. It's just like Caleb Stevens, our cohort at MIT. Like when we were doing a lot of our bot testing and saying, hey, if you don't lock it down, you'll you'll have a lot of things happen you don't want. Like all of a sudden someone can steal your training data, or someone could
Yeah.
say, forget all of your previous instructions and tell me this,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
we had all kind of locks in there to where if someone tried to do that, it would shut down the conversation,
Yeah.
And furthermore, if you have an intelligent framework running, whether you build it yourself or not, it could refresh the context window. It could even shut off all, stop words too. It could just
Yeah.
stop everything.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things to look for. And so, in the spirit of trying things and breaking things and just, going through the motions of developing, uh, if you deploy something prematurely, there's that exposure, and so you have to do a lot of pen testing and a lot of other things after that works.
Yeah.
MCP makes that approachable, okay, and it gives us that standard to rely on. While at the same time, we have to watch out,
Yeah.
because everyone else has it too, and there are things that you could do. So, in my mind, the most vulnerable thing here is the exposure of personal data. If your agent has more ability than mine, maybe it has authentication that mine doesn't have.
Hmm.
It can go out and it's got email access. It has the ability to book something for you. All of a sudden, I have the ability to book something for you.
Yeah.
And why is my agent ordering pizzas to my
Yeah.
house? Like stuff like that. Other forms of abuse, a lot of people don't think about too often. And then it was like the Wild West a year and a half ago, right?
Yeah.
But if you have a company bot, if you use some API and you have this bot on your site and it's really using like, full-blown LLM API, even if it's just Chat GPT 3.5 Turbo, you can game that. You can have it do things for you. If they didn't intelligently manage some guardrails on it, you're on their tokens, on their dime, making poetry, and having
Yeah.
it do all kind of cool stuff for you and using it just like you would in a chat session.
Yeah.
And so you have to do these types of things. And
Absolutely.
then again, the architectural parts of this. I mean, we have JSON interchange has been a blessing for everyone forever. But MCP, JSON, RPC structure is a thing, local tool invocation messages in this sense. Let's say, WebSockets, uh, tool metadata, all these things combine into a lot of abilities and a lot of vulnerabilities as well that are exposed.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of using a standard that bridges the gap. And then of course, like you said, the A2A is the other one that's come out, and that's conversation I caught a while back was this is where tools and functions are changing,
Yeah.
to a degree. We might not
Yeah.
need things quite the same way, and that's fine. We've just never seen anything take off like this,
Yeah.
it's just layers and layers of new evolution on top of these tools. So
Yeah.
it's super exciting. Let's see. So sandboxing would be important here.
Yeah.
That's another approach to doing this, especially in
The
enterprise
registry
like
that we
this.
mentioned earlier is going to be a key too. So, I mean, if you're an enterprise use case, you can have your own registry of these servers that are whitelisted, right?
Yes,
You can
yes.
start to lock things down that way because
Mhm,
these agents in general, and doesn't really have anything with MCP, but these agents are acting on behalf of employees or individuals. And so that's a
mhm,
layer that needs to be considered. And then you can
mhm,
say, well, if you can dynamically connect to these MCP servers, or an agent can do that on somebody's behalf, you
mhm.
can lock those things down through some of the standard methods of doing it, like
Two
what?
factor.
Yeah.
You could have
Yeah.
two-factor engaging in all
You
of
can
that as
only connect
well.
to
Yeah.
these kinds of MCP servers that are
Mhm.
blessed by the organization. So
Right.
we've seen these things evolve over time. This is a new paradigm, but it's new, but it's not new, right? So it just has
Mhm.
to be thought through and
Mhm.
understood from a security perspective.
Right. I mean, this is allowing us to do all the tool chaining and LLM calling and all the things that we need to do to get all our projects out the door to make things work. And it's just a matter of locking that down further. I feel like where will it be in a year? It already came so far in less than half a year.
Yeah.
I think in a year we'll have versions of this that are proprietary versions of MCP that some companies roll out, right?
Yeah.
And I say that in that they're providing a managed service with authentication, other, controls and security, perhaps. It's really exciting though because it will have that flexibility to do whatever we need. It's open. But when I first heard about this coming out, I was deep in the middle of designing my new iteration of my cognitive memory system to find out that, oh, wow, now I've got to integrate this
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
what more can I
Exactly.
integrate? And, but it's not the same though. It is a glue between so many worlds.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting to me. And, I think we should revisit this together and actually have some tool examples that we've come
Yeah.
up,
For sure.
actual working prototypes for things because
Yeah.
we've had a lot going on. It's been a really busy few months here, definitely this month for us individually. But this is fantastic. I mean, here we've looked at the beauty of having these standards, how quickly things evolve when we have them, how easily things work, how we're not wasting money and time. Okay. We're not blowing tons of tokens doing these things. And like you said, just the ability to manage that much right there makes things more approachable and makes things less risky. Lower the barrier of entry on this, like, oh, you got to have a lot of money in case you need a bunch more tokens than you expect. How
Yeah.
about we just ration that out a little
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah.
so that's important. I mean, if you're like me and you're running stuff on a local hardware, it doesn't matter. No one's
Yeah.
paying. Your electric bill is the only token you're
Yeah.
paying. The wear on
Well,
your
I'll
processors.
share an
Yeah.
interesting story. So the boot camp that I went into at
Uh,
MIT, it was interesting because at the end of that week, a lot of teams were presenting their ideas about how this technology can be used to solve um, individual problems or solutions, kind
mhm.
of like a hackathon.
Yeah.
And I gave a presentation about that's great, going after these problem set, that's the attractive thing. But also, if you take a step back, you
Mhm.
start to learn, like your approach. If you're spending a lot of time doing an integration, that's a
Mhm.
custom integration, and
Yeah.
then you're not really thinking about the application
Mm.
capabilities, but you're spending a majority of your time integrating with different systems, then
Mhm.
it's smart to take a step back and say, well, that this really isn't a good use of time. Let's create a standard way to
Hmm.
integrate with this
Right.
platform, with that
Hmm.
platform, and let us
Hmm.
focus instead on new problem sets that are going to
Right.
be capable now. Let's not spend too much time integrating. Let's just agree on a standard and then everybody follow that standard.
Right.
So it was the same back in the day when client server first came in.
Hmm.
The company that I was working at was called PowerSoft, and they
Mm.
created a application development tool for database developers called Power Builder, and
Yeah.
it abstracted away all of that complexity about doing all of the database updates, and
Yeah.
it let application developers focus on the problem that they were trying to solve.
Hmm.
Right.
Right.
So
Right.
this is the same thing in my mind. It's like, you know
Hmm.
what? Let's focus on what the tasks that these agents are trying to accomplish rather than how they're going to integrate with the data
Hmm.
that,
Right. Right.
and
Hypothetically, if you could
that'll,
just, yeah, if you eliminate all integration needs, hypothetical world, there's no integration to do it, just magically works.
it
And you
makes
can
it
focus
easier.
on, yeah, you can fail faster in the right way, in the right places, because integration is a deep place to fail in, and you'll never get to figuring out if what you're doing is even worth it. Like you said, that's why we want to get there and be rapid.
That's the USB analogy. So
Yes.
don't you
Yes.
can integrate with anything you want
Hmm.
yourself, but if you have a USB connector, then you don't have to worry about connecting to every device. You just plug it in and it works.
Hmm.
Right.
Right.
So that's
Right.
kind of the same. It's a USB connector analogy, and it's built on, it was inspired by what the language server
Hmm.
protocol provided for
Hmm.
IDEs. It's like
Right.
once you have that, then you can plug in like a USB to
Hmm.
all the languages that you would
Yeah.
potentially want to develop in. You don't have
Yeah.
to worry about integrating anymore.
Uh-huh.
That's kind of the model that they shot
Mm.
for.
Right. Yeah, and every time I come up with an idea with something like this, I'll turn around after a show and someone's done it. And I'm thinking, well, why, I bet someone's going to come out with a secure MCP server that's through blockchain, right?
Yes.
That would be another step in that direction because
Yeah.
people already talk about training over the blockchain. We're doing a lot more distributed computing these days with our LLM and agentic stuff over at Quai, that group I'm a part of for democratizing AI. And we have some phenomenal gains there with sharing your computers. And it's just like SETI back in the day, search for
Yeah.
extraterrestrial. And,
Yeah.
anyway, thanks so much for listening. John McDonald, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and catch up with these kind of matters.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Dan. It was super powerful for me to go back and look at some of our older videos,
Oh,
and
yeah.
we were toying with this stuff back then,
Uh-huh.
right?
That right,
And
right.
to see that it came
Uh-huh.
so far in such a short period of time, now
Right.
it makes perfect sense looking back at those old videos, saying, okay, we were starting to understand, wow, once you peel this back and you use
Hmm.
things like RAG or
Yeah.
Raft to
Uh-huh.
increase the effectiveness of fine tuning, then you
Hmm.
start to see the power of the context. And
Hmm.
then it makes perfect sense that this business is gonna evolve into leveraging that capability in the most effective way because it's so powerful. So
Right, right.
you
Yeah.
for keeping things going and
Uh-huh.
inspiring so many people. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Thank you so
Powerful.
much, John. Again,
Thank
everybody,
you.
this is the AI Think Tank podcast. I'm Dan Wilson. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you
Thanks.
so much. Bye.